Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Marilou Carrillo.
And I'm Brad Newcombe. Christians around the world profess belief in one God, one Spirit, and one church. But as history sadly shows us, there often is not agreement on how that is acted out and takes place in the world in which we live. It's commonplace for Christians, churches, church members to squabble with each other on what they believe and also how that gets experienced by themselves and other people, other cultures. Why do Christians fight with each other? Why can we be so intolerant? With me to talk about that is Brian Thorpe, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Church of Canada in BC, and Jeremy Bell, who is pastor at Kitsilano Christian Community, a Baptist congregation in Vancouver. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, when Mary Lou and I talked earlier about the program, we wanted to start on a gathering which is known as Mission Fest. And that's a gathering of Christians that takes place annually and in Canada Place in Vancouver. And this past year, the United Church was barred from taking part in it. And the reason was that the United Church does not believe that Jesus is the only way to God. Can you comment on this whole Mission Fest scandal, Brian?
Well, there are really two ways of reflecting on it. One is to deal with the actual issues that were involved. The other is to deal with the process. And I want to begin by talking about the process because even your description about the United Church, I don't remember what you exactly said, but the United Church doesn't believe that
Jesus is the only way to God.
Okay. That needs a whole bunch of elaboration and reflection and thought about it. And in order to do that, you have to have a place where that's okay. And that gets to the process question. What was frustrating for me about whatever happened around Mission Fest was that we spent a lot of time doing kind of posturing with each other, you know, reflecting on who's included and who's not, that kind of thing. And what was missing in that was what we actually believe. You know, spending time with each other, talking about what divides us, what unites us.
But how? Okay, just before we go on, because I want to ask Jeremy his reaction. But how can you spend time when you're barred, talking with each other when you were barred from the event? I mean, it's precisely that point that you should have been able to go to Canada Place and be there.
That's precisely the point. That the emphasis seemed to be on making a point of who's included and who's not, rather than exploring the grounds on which you'd make that kind of decision. Because I think there are probably, for an organization like Missions Fest, there would be legitimate grounds to say, no, it's not appropriate for you to be a part of this. In other words, every community has boundaries. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we reflect on those? And so it was significant to me that when this happened, there were probably the most negative kind of stuff occurred within our own community, within the United Church of Canada.
What was negative?
Individuals and congregations whose reaction was to say, right on, we're really glad that the United Church, our church, was barred because it gives, you know, it provides us with points. In the midst of all that, I got a phone call from Jeremy. And the significant thing about Jeremy's call, you know, a Baptist minister close by where I lived, was that our conversation was about the issues, about what separates and what divides. And it was a very significant call, a very supportive call.
So go ahead.
Yeah, not because Jeremy was taking a political position and saying, Missions Fest is wrong and you, the United Church, are right in this conflict. But rather, what I got from your call, Jeremy, was saying, we need to talk about what's going on here because this is yet another illustration. And history, the 2,000 years of Christianity, are littered with examples of various Christians living with stereotypes about the other.
So Jeremy, what was going on from your point of view?
I think that the whole Mission Fest discussion and other discussions like it. There was another conference in Vancouver which was sort of tried to bring sort of the far left and the far right together in our culture. I think the whole discussion and divisiveness of it, I wouldn't quite put so strongly as calling it a scandal, but I think it's a great concern, is partly about process. And I think it was a wake-up call to all constituencies. It was a wake-up call to how process is done. And I think in future years you'll notice groups like that particular conference saying, listen, let's agree on some basics. Let's include Christian groups, and let's agree that we're not going to be seen, even implicitly, to be undermining each other. And that'll be our concern. I think in future years you'll see more of that. But I think the wake-up call for the evangelical community, if you want to paint a broader brush, is about process and about discussion, about dialogue. I think the wake-up call for some of the mainline constituencies is that this dialogue has been so absent for so long that to suddenly enter into it is a shock to the system for all. And there's a lot of catch-up to be done in this area. And so let's leave for a minute the far right and the far left, theologically speaking, in our community, and concentrate on those who are very much concerned with being supportive of one another. And I know that we have all been vulnerable to being wounded. Now, we expect to be wounded in life, but we find it most difficult to be wounded by sisters and brothers in Christ. And that becomes a difficulty. So it's a wake-up call for a constituency that needs to look at process. We all need to look at process and how we discuss things with each other, how we seek each other's forgiveness, how we encourage, how we pray for each other. But we also need to recognize that other constituencies, some of the aspects, and Mission Fest isn't monolithic, United Church isn't monolithic. We need to realize that this dialogue has been absent for so long that misunderstanding is
Why has it been absent for so long?
I think that we spend a fair amount of time caricaturing each other. I think one of the significant statements, let me pick two interesting people. Brian Stiller, Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, General Secretary, talked about enculturating the language of the gospel in the culture. And a more significant statement than that is Bob Smith, who, in a follow-through to apologizing to First Nations people, said, listen, we don't apologize for the gospel, we apologize for the way we've presented it. And there's every reason for Christians to apologize for the way they presented the gospel, but I think it's a little tiresome that we keep on implicitly apologizing for the gospel itself. And I think he made an excellent point in doing that. And I think it's something that estranges us, because there are some of us that really feel that we can see this whole vision of what God wants for us here on earth. And some who are fixated on the hereafter. And there needs to be a bridging, which I think the full gospel brings to us, of both. And that's part of the estrangement of the discussion.
So is the lack of dialogue about Christianity, or is it about power?
Or is it about fear? I mean, there are just a number of ways of looking at that. I think one of the things that happens is that the gospel, ultimately, the gospel of Jesus is about losing your life in order to gain it. And in a sense, that should mean that we're reckless risk takers, that we're willing to open ourselves up to be vulnerable and that kind of thing. But we're also human. And the problem is that we inherit a tradition that for a long period of time became attached to power. You know, the whole Christendom era. Christianity, after the time of Constantine, became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And from that time on, it was the official religion of some empire or other throughout our history until very recently. And in that sense, we become prone to the worst kinds of abuse of power, the worst kinds of human sin. And so in that regard, when people when they confuse the promises of the gospel with the reality of human power here on earth, then when they feel any threat to that power, they become defensive, they go on the attack. You know, it's all... I don't think Christians are immune from all of those kind of dynamics.
Part of that erosion of power is that there's several views of the experience of power in Christianity. Sectarian Protestantism, which is an unfortunate word, but nevertheless a real word, groups like Baptists and Mennonites have been around really since the Presbyterians, and Methodists have only been around really a couple of hundred years. But the reality is that some Christian groups are more used to being establishment groups and being in power, and some are not. And some find themselves marginalized, sometimes by media, sometimes by other groups. And therefore, part of the dissension, part of the mistrust, part of the hurt and pain is that kind of criticism. Name calling. I've been in churches, and not churches you would expect. Churches often that claim to be incredibly tolerant, in which there's always the caricature. And often it's a caricature of American fundamentalist Christianity, not the kind of Christian faith that's often experienced within Canadian culture. The Canadian culture has experienced, and European culture has experienced, all through the 19th century, Anglican evangelicals, emancipation of the slaves, child labor laws, all that kind of stuff. And in this century, sectarian people, Tommy Douglas, Martin Luther King Jr., John Diefenbaker, the Bill of Rights, all happen to be Baptists. So our history is a much bigger blend than we like to think, and we need to be careful in our sort of our caricatures, the demonizing of each other.
But we tend to caricature when we don't know people, when we never talk to them, right?
We do. But then sometimes we need to feel comfortable with differences. Not comfortable that we feel comfortable with a disagreement. David Lamb, who's a wonderful person, very well versed in Confucian theology, a committed Christian, says it's not good enough to tolerate, because that's like holding your breath. We must celebrate diversity. And that doesn't mean to say you need to compromise what you believe, what you think.
So how do we see our own self-right? Like you said that, you've heard in surprising places people make caricatures and stereotypes, and I suppose you could even go, judgments and so on. And we all have biases, and we all have areas that we want to protect, where we feel fear, we feel vulnerable, and so on. How do we sort of see those areas in ourselves? Because that's really where it starts.
I think we begin.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
I think we begin by allowing the question from other people. I think we begin by reading the scriptures and praying about being convicted of some of our indiscretions. I think we begin by, when we hear it, and just to listen and to be willing to pick it up. I think we also need to just say, listen, conformity is unnecessary and is unhelpful, and the urge to conform. There's a book put out by a Christian publisher, which remain nameless in the States, called Spiritual Correctness, full of religious cliches, and just making fun of how we use, and it's an evangelical publisher, making fun of how we trivialize some of our religious language. And there are some wonderful things, some conviction that many Christian groups bring to us in terms of social action, okay? And there's some real convictions in terms of not continuing to apologize for the gospel that we need to bring together a bit.
Well, we're also making an assumption about diversity, and yet some people are looking at Christianity as lacking in unity. I think that's kind of confusing at times, that we say on the one hand that we honor diversity, on the other hand, we want to move towards unity, and I don't know when one side is being used, because if we're not able to achieve unity among Christian groups, let's say, it's a big leap to me to then say, yes, we honor and tolerate diversity.
Yeah, and to me, one of the keys is how much listening happens, genuine listening, because so often we exercise tolerance when we basically grit our teeth and say, okay, this is what I have to face, and but deep inside I know I'm absolutely right, and that's very different from saying, I'm grounded in the faith that I've been given. And in that grounding, I'm going to open myself up and be vulnerable to this person. I firmly believe that interfaith dialogue, for example, only works if you're willing to, in the groundedness of your own tradition and your own belief, to open yourself up to the extent of saying, I'm willing to be transformed or to be changed.
That's willing to lose everything.
To lose everything, yeah. And you see, one of the experiences, I was the university chaplain many years ago in Saskatchewan, and I remember at that time there was a philosophy professor who taught at the University of Saskatchewan, who was interestingly enough, a former minister, but who
many
had a complete transition. And his goal in life was to present the case for atheism. And he'd do this, with 18-year-old vulnerable first-year students. Now, we had an interesting dialogue among the campus ministers, because some of them said, we need to do everything we can to protect our students from this guy. But my argument was that, in a sense, the real risk in that is that the only message in the end that you communicate is that Christian faith is so weak it can't withstand that, that instead what you need to do is to do a very proactive grounding of people in the faith, in the theology, and at the same time say, if this is of God, then nothing can destroy it. And be open and listen and engage in dialogue with the other. Because
which was Gamaliel's comment in the book of Acts about the apostles.
Exactly.
But the opening,
good Jewish wisdom.
The openness and listening is interesting. You mentioned talking to other people of other faiths, and this is where I'm having a bit of trouble, because we want to talk to people of other faiths to strengthen our own beliefs, and yet we are unable to talk to each other. The people
within
or the groups
the Christian community,
within the Christian tradition, and talking about listening, the story that I'm thinking of is a student at the Vancouver School of Theology who was assigned a parish in a Chinese Anglican church, and she's a United Church member. And her comment was that if I had not been assigned to this church because of the course, I would have been out of here after the first week. And it was quite a statement to me about how we actually live this tolerance, this diversity. And what happens from the time of that encounter to the time we say, that's it, I can't stay here. But because she had to stay in that church for this course, she had to stay and learn about not only the Anglicans, but also the Chinese, or vice versa. And the end of her story is that at the end, in the summer, when Sunday school is over, she is going to take this group of Chinese Anglicans to a Chinese United Church. And she could not see that that would have been possible at all if she had not been made to immerse. So my question, or my comment, I guess, is how do we do this? How do we live this, given that there's diversity and that there is going to be intolerance?
Well, given the Apostle Paul gets a lot of bad press in so many areas, in Corinthians about that whole question, I think he's quite reasonable, which he says our threshold for spiritual uncomfortability may be something that we've got to get over, but it also may be simply an obedience to our own conscience and the presence of the Spirit in our lives. He says, listen, I can't cope with this. I mean, you don't hold an AA meeting in a bar, And so there are certain things that are sort of commonsensical, some things that are simply intuition, that I must just with all integrity say, I'm sorry, I can't go with you there. I want to respect, I want to love, I want to pray, for one another, but I can't go with you there. And there'll be different places for different people. We need to be careful that they're not cultural reasons, that they're not derogatory reasons, that they're not discriminatory reasons, but we still need to recognize that there will be reasons. And we need to feel, we don't feel comfortable outside of conformity. And it's this whole power thing with sometimes the larger Christian groups who have been used to power, wanting to keep that power. And so it has worked as a double-edged sword. The abandonment, this other conference I was referring to, by sort of, if we have concern in community at large, particularly in media, particularly from across the American border, with right-wing fundamentalism, we also have left-wing fundamentalism, which are equally closed. And I think we need to stop the name-calling and say, yes, there'll be some places that are specific to me, my own personality, make sure that they are not discriminatory, and that they're not culturally based, and that they're of God in some sense. Is that's something?
Right. Go ahead.
Well, Mary Lou, something you raised triggered something for me, and that was where you said, in terms of interfaith, we can talk about diversity and communication and being open, but it sometimes seems more difficult within the Christian community. And I think there is some truth in that oftentimes we're more vulnerable not with people who are completely different, who offer an alternative worldview, but those who are similar with difference, in a sense. Again, going back to the experience on the university campus, one of the things that was fascinating to me at this time in the 70s was that among some of those on the radical left, the sort of Marxist, Leninist, the Trotskyites, the people they loathed the most were not really capitalists or rugged individualists, but they were social democrats and socialists. You know, people who were somewhat similar, but who's in their ability to go toward a middle, which recognizes the ambiguity in human life. And I would say in Christian terms, one of the distinctions I would make is that there are people who are absolutely convinced that they somehow hold within themselves the truth. And that can occur in many ways. I've met liberals, for example, who believe that their own personal experience is the only authority they need. And there's a certain kind of incredible arrogance and self-deception in that. It's just as bad
Or
as
conservatives
those
that say their pastor's experience is the only experience they can receive, which is probably more as dangerous.
And on either side, the people they resent most oftentimes are those who are struggling in the middle. Those who are struggling with the fact that they don't want to go to a kind of radical relativism. Because if you say, well, every truth is legitimate as long as somebody believes sincerely, then you mean that you're really saying that neo-Nazis should be sitting up here with Jeremy and I because they're just as legitimate as whatever we're reflecting. Obviously, we have to make judgments, and that's, I think, what you were saying, Jeremy, that there are times when boundaries become important. And yet at
the right reasons, make sure that
for the right reasons. At the same time, we're profoundly human. And that to me is one of the things about being a believer, is that you turn certain things over to God and recognize that those are in God's realm and not in ours. You know,
and part of those turning things over to God is to say, is to learn how to apologize for one another and to ask forgiveness and to grant forgiveness to one another. That's a difficult thing. You may not think you have anything to apologize for.
I was going to say, when people think they're right, they're not going to be in a posture to apologize.
But then that's the place. Charles Haddon Spurgeon once said in the 19th century, some people are like tree stumps in the middle of a field. You need to plow around them and leave them to rot on some issues. So that would be fair. But, you know, let's go back to someone called Hugh Dobson, who was a Methodist and then the United Church, who was in charge of evangelism and social service for the United Church here at the time of Union. One of the people that represent many of the constituency that might be watching this program, he brought those two things together. He sent railroad cars of food, you know, to the prairies during the Depression, and was committed to women's suffrage, committed to sharing the faith to people who didn't know the faith. And that kind of blend, that kind of remelding of things that are natural, interwoven parts of the full gospel, complete gospel, are really something we need to rediscover.
I just had something to comment about boundaries. It's a possible contradiction for me is this, you know, allowing ourselves some boundaries, for example, in talking about Christianity, Christian groups, diversity, and differences in theology. But when I'm going to try to kind of broaden this, and when I think of what you mentioned earlier, Brian, about the link, the association that much of the world has between Christianity and colonization, is that in that case, there were no boundaries. I guess my question is, there's part of Christian tradition is to spread the gospel and spread it within our boundaries and outside of our boundaries. And that to me is a potential contradiction, because what is the interest among Christians and between Christians and people of other faiths to spread this gospel, whatever that might mean for each group?
There also becomes a contradiction in your question, because if we have a boundaryless world and we want to be inclusive in our whole world, we also live together and we'll jostle with each other and encourage each other in terms of our own value systems. So when we lose the boundaries in the world, we also lose some of our autonomy, unfortunately. Never mind the fact that Christianity was appalling in some aspects of its, also in some cases it was humanizing, the traders and the capitalists that went ahead of them and created even more havoc before they came. So it's a two-edged question, but anyway, sorry.
No, I think one of the illustrations of that exactly the question you're asking that came to me is one of the issues I've had to deal with in my job has been related to a land question on the edge of one of the reserves on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and it's a piece of property that in the latter part of the last century the Presbyterian Church acquired, set up a school, a residential school for Aboriginal children, and according to the Hausat people, their understanding of the royal tradition was that when this ceased to be used for education, it would be turned back to the Hausat nation. Well, in 1953, the United Church, the inheritors of this Presbyterian piece of land, sold it to private individuals. And so now we're dealing with that. And in the course of our meetings with the Hausat people, one of the elders in that community was talking about residential boundaries being set. And he was talking about the McKenna-Bride Commission, which set the boundaries. And somebody else began to dispute and said, but the church really didn't have any involvement in that. And this very wise elder said, but you're all the same people. The people setting the boundaries, the people in government. And in the turn of the century, and this is what Jeremy's talking about, people being in power. Like, I represent mainstream Protestant Christianity, which was hand in glove with those who ran industry and government at the turn of the century in this land. And yet there I was representing a very humbled church. I mean, the United Church of Canada has gone through rough times and has become very disestablished. We feel envious at times of the Baptists because we see them as a more success, in worldly terms, a more successful church. So it's kind of funny because Jeremy sees us as the inheritors of mainstream Christianity, and
there are challenges to both.
And there are challenges to both. We're both right in that sense. But I think Christianity in that kind of context, where you're inheriting a time of wealth and privilege and an association with empire, and yet you're in a humbled position, is more authentic. Because we can be with the Hausat nation in a way at the turn of the century.
So we can stop apologizing for the gospel and be careful how we communicate it.
Okay, and of course you could just lead from one topic into another. We're out of time. Thank you both, Jeremy, Bill, and Brian Thorpe.
But the faith is not.
That's right. No, yes, that's right. No, but we are out of time. Anyways, thanks for watching Pressure Point. I'm Brad Newcombe, and Marilou Carrillo and I have been talking with Brian and Jeremy on looking toward Christian tolerance. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.